Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We're really pleased that you're here to join us for Oxygen's webinar series. Today's edition is Building the Business Case for Learning. I'm Simon Pollock. I'm an experienced designer here at Oxygen, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for our discussion today. If you've been to an Oxygen event before, welcome back to all of our friends of the show that are on the phone. And if you're new, here's the breakdown. At Oxygen, we prepare people for people and their businesses for what's next. That's because change is inevitable in this world that we live in today. It's driven by all kinds of forces, internal and external. And especially in this last year, we've seen so many organizations need to accelerate their move into digital services and processes. So we at Oxygen, we design and deliver modern and experiential learning, and we help people do the upfront work to adapt their organizations to deliver those services and processes. So adapting your team, your organization, your entire company, it all takes that really thoughtful work, and that's where we come in. And lucky us, speaking of thoughtful work, we are joined today by Oxygen's Vice President of Enterprise Solutions and man who knows a thing or two about an operating model, Rob Osuch. Howdy, Rob.
Hello, everybody.
And also with us today, our Vice President of Sales Enablement and resident jazz musician, playing the tunes today and the slides, Catherine Shao. Hi, Catherine.
Thanks, Simon. It's good to be here.
Together, Rob and Catherine are a mighty team. They've helped Oxygen customers at Fortune 300 companies secure executive support and build modern learning and sales enablement functions. And they've engineered the systems and processes that enable our own team to do what we do so well at scale. So we're really lucky to have them here today. Just a quick plug before we get started. If you like what you hear from us, keep your eyes on the chat window for more information about our next webinar, the importance of UI UX in learning and experience design. That's coming up in June, but that's the future. And this is now. So let's look at our conversation for today. All righty. So we've got a few different buckets here for our conversation, and we're looking forward to just having a really relaxed and informal approach here. So we're not going to do slides the whole time, but this is what we'll loosely cover: why a business case is needed when you're trying to make those organizational changes, getting into the mindset of your stakeholders and sponsors and building that support in those relationships. And then when you're off and running, how you're going to show value regardless of the size and scope of what you are doing. So Rob, Catherine, I've cooked up some questions for you to get us started. And I know both of you have some more visuals in case we need them. To everyone on the line with us, we want to hear from you. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to post questions, and I'll be keeping my eye on that. You can also chat with us, I believe. And so let us know if you're having any trouble hearing us or anything like that. I'll do my best to get you squared away. So without further ado, let's start with our first question. And this is for you, the audience. Just to give Catherine and Rob a good sense of where you're at. Let us know in the chat window, where do you sit in your organization? What's your relationship to the people who fund and approve your projects?
That's a good one.
Yeah. And I'm going to put that in for everybody as well.
I think you got to put that for all attendees, Simon.
Aha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
All panelists and attendees. All right. That's the second question. Here's the first question. My apologies. These are out of order.
Great. We got a fellow exec team member. That's great. We've worked with a few of those.
Yep.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Well, if you have a second to answer the questions, please do. There we go. There's another one from Karen.
Field enablement, competing priorities. I mean, that's one of the big reasons why we need a business case, so we can help with the prioritization of stuff. It's a great one, Karen. I love chief storyteller. I haven't seen that before. That's a great way to articulate yourself. Thanks, Teresa. There's a lot of storytelling in business cases, particularly the more strategic they are, right, Catherine? You're the storyteller on our side of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit
We
more of
do.
the engineer for those of you on the panel. I get into the data and structure, and Catherine's really good about communicating and visualizing.
Yep. FTE decision maker. Yeah, that's great. Well, we got some good stuff here, I think, for these folks, Rob,
Yeah,
for sure.
That's awesome. And thanks for those answers. And please do pipe up, ask questions. And we're happy to rabbit hole a bit with y'all. We want to make sure that our discussion is relevant for you. So keep using the chat window or the Q&A, whatever is most convenient. And I'll keep my eyes on there, and I'll jump in if we have more questions. Challenges for funding. Sometimes training is not the answer. It's more strategic problem, definitely. Well, with that, let's open it up to Catherine and Rob here, and we'll start with our first question for either of you. This is open to the table. Why do you need
Yeah.
a business case to back up your learning initiatives?
Let me jump in first, Simon, because I actually feel like the next two bullets that follow that question I was thinking about, it's like get in the mindset of your stakeholders and sponsors. Depending upon where the initiative is, and we'll talk about this probably more during the webinar or during the podcast here, but the higher or more strategic and the more complex and the more business impact, the bigger value, the larger the initiative, there's more stakeholders involved. So you got to drive alignment. You got to get agreement across the outcomes, the needs, the specifics of the solution. And there's a lot to navigate in terms of complexity. The higher up you go, the more stakeholders that are involved. So I think that's a big component of why you need a business case, is because you have to help get alignment across a bunch of different people that have differing perspectives on what the problem and the needs are for the business and how to best solve them in a measurable and impactful way. The other thing that we talked about here is how to show value regardless of size and scope. So if you're in a shared service function, whether you're a leader or a major contributor to a shared service like learning and development, and I've worked a lot with L&D, IT leaders, marketing, etc. It's one thing to get the funding for your initial project or your initial initiative. It's another thing to continue to get the funding so you can show the value of what you're doing. You know, the fancy word that we call that is benefits realization. So the business case sets up what's possible. The benefits realization says, well, here's what we've achieved, here's what we've accomplished. So the business case lays out that framework for how you're going to have measurable business impact for the projects or the initiatives that you're going to do for the business. I'll let you jump in on that one, Catherine.
Yeah, I love it. It's interesting. So, you know, me with my kind of sales enablement lens that I like to apply here, I think of a business case as a big internal sale, or it can be a small internal sale, but it's an internal sale nonetheless. You know, you have to have that forcing function sometimes to structure something up. And it's the same kind of thing that, you know, sellers have to do. You got to get a lot of people on the same page to make a decision to fund something that's going to have a specific type of outcome. And as Rob said, a realization of benefits. So I think that, like, if anybody is trying to get the money to fund projects, whether they're giant transformational projects or, you know, just kind of like smaller initiatives, there's that internal selling component and kind of almost like stages of a sale associated with a business case.
Yeah, so Teresa's saying benefits realization, is that the same as ROI for training or learning outcomes? Yes, yes, and yes. And the way I look at benefits is sometimes they're qualitative and quantitative. So and I think we can talk about this a little bit later on, but it's not always about ROI, return on investment. Although when we do data and we do metrics, we try to translate it, you know, correlate it to some kind of monetary impact. Either we're saving money, we're driving growth or revenue for the business. Ultimately, efficiency and effectiveness measures are where we're trying to drive towards. But there may be more qualitative features or functions or benefits that are also being provided to the business that can be qualitative in nature. Not everything can be measured in terms of dollars and cents and efficiencies, but that will give you a little bit of context around benefits. And we like to use a mix of those things as part of our storytelling, Teresa, when we present a business case. It really depends upon the audience you're speaking to and who you're presenting to. So if you're presenting to like a CFO or finance oriented audience, you're probably going to have something that's more monetary oriented, versus if you're talking to the recipients of the service or the project, or what we call the audience, if we're doing learning, who are the learners, they may be more interested into the features of the learning and what they can expect in terms of their professional development, or in terms of achieving their jobs or their objectives and their role. What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I think this actually gets into that question of you understand your stakeholders, which is one kind of group that you have to appeal to, and then you have to understand that end audience, which is where a lot of the benefits are realized. Is if you can drive an outcome through that audience and you can articulate that in your business case, that's ultimately what a lot of stakeholders are going to care about. But in terms of how you frame it, you got to know those stakeholders for sure. And I think, Rob, you hit it very well of saying, like, look, a finance audience or a finance group of stakeholders is going to be looking at one thing, potentially a business unit set of stakeholders, whether they are, say, operating a call center or dealing with some other customer experience aspect. They're going to have a different lens. And you might want to be able to articulate both of those things in order to unlock that funding.
Yeah, that's key.
Yeah. So I know that, like, we would love to be able to show some examples as well. And, we have a number of different artifacts. But I think, I would love to continue that question about, like, getting inside the heads of stakeholders. And then we can sort of get into some of those examples.
Yeah, can I build on that for just a second, Catherine? Because
Yeah.
I think now that we're diving into like stakeholders, a common question that we're asked when we're brought in, and this is where Catherine is outstanding because she's done so much work around value, communicating value to different stakeholders. What I traditionally do when I'm thinking about, an initiative that we're going to take on for our clients looking to position inside the organization, is we tell them, think of your stakeholders in 3 different categories. Category number 1 is, who's your executive sponsor? Who's going to fund this thing? And I talked about earlier, like a finance lens. Well, it could be your direct report or your boss's boss, but you have to have language to talk about, those tangible ROI, quantitative, qualitative benefits to your executive sponsor, because they want to know what's the value, what's the return on my investment. Clearly, we talked about the audience, right? So if you're doing, as Catherine alluded to, if you're building something for a customer care organization, they typically talk about call handle times and things of that nature, like how you can map into the metrics that they're focused into a call center, versus we work a lot with sales organizations. So it's about getting that first deal and getting the process you go through to get access, get the conversations flowing with your customer, and then be able to close your first deal if you're a new seller. So those are some good examples. And then lastly, there's another category, like people often forget, like the bigger the initiative, often you have to bring in partners, internal partners or external partners into your business case. Like I know when we work with L&D, a lot of times we've got to bring in IT. And sometimes you got to bring in marketing if there's sales enablement involved. And so you have to think about the supply chain that you're going to have to work with your partners to get them on board so that you can get all these different types of stakeholders engaged and in alignment in terms of the project or the initiative you're taking on.
Yeah, I want to build on that aspect too, because there's this idea of, I think a lot of us, in sales enablement and also in the learning profession, I mean, we have our language that makes sense to us, and that's great. And also a lot of times, if we are really wanting to have the conversation with a different group of stakeholders, we have to kind of figure out either how to set aside our lingo or how to translate it into something that makes business sense for those stakeholders. So if we're in learning and we start talking about Bloom's taxonomy and, all those types of like objectives and things like that, I mean, that might work great for us in the learning profession, But we want to actually translate that into something that is more like an outcome for the business, which might be like some of the metrics that Rob mentioned, average call handle time or customer satisfaction scores or things of that nature.
Yeah, that's it. For those of you that know me, particularly Catherine and Simon, I don't come from a learning background at all. My background is in systems integration, doing traditional management consulting the last 15, 20 years. And so when I came in, and I've been working a lot with Oxygen and working with our stakeholders, like I was kind of overwhelmed with, it was good information on in terms of the learning objectives and the learning language, but you could see the contrast between how a lot of the folks we speak to in learning and development, how they're trying to present to a business audience, that it's not put in the language for someone like me to understand, so we can understand how I'm impacted from a business perspective. That's I think one of the great gifts that Catherine has from a capability standpoint is being able to translate some of that learning technical language. And I worked a lot with IT. They had the same challenge, frankly. How do you translate that and get it communicated in a language that can be understood by your business stakeholders?
Yeah, that's cool. You touched on a couple of things there, Rob, that made me think about, as you were talking about different types of stakeholders, like different types of initiatives, right? And and we actually have something to show on that, which I think would be, great for our audience to hear about. Just a kind of framework to think about the relative sizes and, potentially the length or the duration of an initiative, and to think about what needs to be, like what you focus on in a business case for those types of things. I can share my screen again.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let me figure out how to do that here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. All right. And I assume everybody can see that.
Yeah. So let me dive into this a little bit, Catherine, and then I think you have a lot of commentary about how to position with our different stakeholders. So I often use a complexity calculator when I'm talking to our different stakeholders in terms of what degree of complexity. The higher the complexity, we better hope that there's more value being delivered to the business, because if there isn't, then we're probably not setting ourselves up for success. So what makes things complex? Well, I'm a big PMI, Project Management Institute person. I got my my certification as a project manager many years ago. But they have some great research that they've done at the PMI Institute. And one that really caught my eye is what makes projects complex. And they had a huge survey they did across thousands of executives and hundreds of different companies. And the two biggest things that drive complexity, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, was the number of stakeholders involved. So as you can see here, as you start to go up from a more tactical operational perspective, it says it's a little small on the screen. I don't know if we can increase the size a little bit for the team. But as you go from more tactical to something that's more strategic and more impactful across the enterprise, you're dealing with a higher number of stakeholders. I alluded to this earlier. And that's where we find most of our effort working with our executive sponsors to bring us in, is making sure we've got really holistic, very concrete communication planning and messaging. This is where the sales piece comes in, to make sure that we're very specific on the different types of stakeholders and what's our messaging need to look like to properly frame an initiative in language that they'll understand and that's impactful. So the number of stakeholders, if that's high, complexity is likely going to be high. The second thing that we really see, and this is actually one of the biggest challenges we see, is how much ambiguity in the scope is there. Typically, as you get more strategic, you get more broad, holistic, aspirational outcomes and objectives, but trying to get alignment on what are the business requirements and translating those requirements into a set of initiatives or set of projects that can be executed by the team, that's where we see a lot of the challenges, because there's a lot of translation that has to happen. And that's the other work that Catherine and I do a lot of. There's a lot of mechanical stuff doing the physical business case and ROIs and data metrics, but managing that ambiguity and that scope and trying to get alignment across all these different stakeholders and communicating and getting alignment is a lot of effort, particularly as you go up that more strategic level of type of initiative, where it's, like I said, an enterprise impact. There's multiple organizations, hundreds or thousands of people could be impacted, because we typically work with companies that are in the size of 10,000 plus employees. So that's what we mean by this complexity chart, is this sort of gives you a frame of reference to say, for the project I'm taking on and how I need to position it, how much complexity can I anticipate?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it seems like no matter what, you still have to be able to show some kind of value,
Yeah.
right? And I find this whole question of like how you present something, this is, a great sort of mental model that we're looking at here to think about the complexity issue. And then there's also the aspect of how do you actually show this information across, what constitutes this structure? And I think we have something else to show on that front, just the components that might be helpful. And then we can talk about, maybe share some examples of how we've actually visualized some of these components. But I think this one here, this is a little bit of a, a takeaway. Maybe some of you might take a couple screenshots or something, but this, in our mind, whether you have a really big initiative or even if it's relatively small, you're still going to have a similar structure for a business case. And I don't know, Rob, is there anything out here that you want to highlight for folks?
Oh, I think I could highlight this whole thing, honestly, because I think all these, as you just alluded to, it doesn't matter how big or how small. These are the common elements that we see, because we've worked on transformative projects, like we're modernizing a large organization of, hundreds of people. And so we would spend months, if weeks and months, putting together very elaborate, very detail-oriented business cases. Some cases our executive PowerPoints could be, 20, 30 slides, and people want to get into that level of rigor versus a project where I think we have a couple examples in there, like we might have just a one pager. But these are the components that we really need to hit in a business case. Like the business requirements are fundamental, right? We have to clearly state what the business problem or the need is, and what's the solution that we're proposing, the features, the functionality. Like this is like table stakes stuff. And then we also have to get into like, and we talked about this in the last webinar in terms of our experience architecture work. Julian did a great job working backwards from our target audience on the business outcomes that we're looking to achieve for that target audience. Like who's the recipient of the work product that's going to be produced or the service that's going to be provided, and how are they going to benefit from it, right? So we get into business outcomes. We talked earlier about ROI metrics, and we got some good examples to walk in with you. Well, I will highlight on ROI metrics. I made one of the projects I took on early in my career. One of the big problems we encountered is we didn't establish a baseline. So when you're talking about metrics and ROI and things of that nature, and you want to get in there, you want to make sure those are clearly defined, they're clearly agreed upon, they're clearly understood, and they're measurable, and you can locate good quality data, and you have a good way to baseline that information so that as you are delivering your project and you're starting to see it being used out in the field, that you have something to compare against in terms of the value that's being delivered. Because without a baseline, it's hard to articulate what we've done and what business impact it's had. So I'd always make sure that you have well-defined metrics and that you've established a baseline so that when we're delivering it in the end state, that we have something to compare against. In terms of a timeline or roadmap, you always got to show people what to expect and when to expect it, and show progress along the way, and be expected to make some turns and changes. Like we used to put together like 3, 4, 5, 6 year roadmaps, but the world is so dynamic today, you're going to have to be ready to adjust based upon the progress that's being made, the changes in the business, the changes in the growth strategy, changes in the organization. So be prepared to pivot or make an adjustment to your timeline or roadmap. But you got to have something there that says, here's what's going to be built, here's when to expect it, and here's when you can expect the timing of the benefits or the value being delivered. You've got resources and budget. So obviously you got to do a good job, saying, here's what we need, not just in terms of monetary value, but here's who we need in the organization to help us deliver on the product or service we're providing. And this goes back to that stakeholder discussion we had earlier about having your partners aligned, like IT, for instance. Make sure that they're in alignment in terms of what's required for their inputs. And then methods. This is about how you collect your how do you go about doing the requirements gathering? We use all kinds of different methods for our transformative work. We do a lot of assessments. So we do stakeholder interviews, focus group surveys, observations. All of that stuff should be documented, because executives love to see that kind of rigor to say, hey, we've conducted X number of interviews. We did X number of surveys. We looked through X number of documents. They like to see that quantified because it builds confidence. Catherine, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think that's a great point. The methods is oftentimes, we'll see somebody has done a survey, and they surveyed their entire seller population as an example. And then kind of like stop there, so that the data that you're collecting actually is almost just limited to perceptions and attitudes of your sellers, and forgetting that there's actually a lot of other people in the organization whose perspectives are going to matter in the solution. You'll have managers, you might have other types of stakeholders. So we try to be as thorough as possible within, the varieties of constraints that we always, come across, so that there's a lot of rigor to the data. And I think any executive that's really trying to understand the details of their business, because I think that, this is the population that tends to get more and more distance from where's reality, really appreciates a rigorous data collection.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Simon,
that's one. Oh, go ahead.
All right. I think Simon wanted to jump in with a question here. So once we get talking about business cases, it's
Yeah,
tough to stop.
right. Yeah.
So feel free to jump in, Simon.
We can totally keep talking about it. And I would love to, if the two of you could share a little bit with our audience. We're talking about, like, this is all these great components, and we've done all this thinking here. And also it's, it's when we're building a business case at Oxygen, it's not just the two of you. Could you two share a little bit more about who's on the team when we build a business case for, we could start at the top and just say, if we're going in and we're going to do an enterprise level business case, who do we work with internally and externally when we're doing this?
That's a great question, Catherine. I think you might be able to tackle that one, and I can give some color, because you're the one that often is the orchestrator to help, render the product. Yep. And you got to get all the inputs, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of that orchestration. So just like I was mentioning, all of these different methods, whether it's interviews, surveys, combinations, they all have to be rendered. And that process of rendering information is not something that just goes and happens in a vacuum. We rely very heavily on our own team to talk through the implications that we're seeing in the data, to see whether or not we all agree that the patterns that one person is seeing are similar to the patterns that somebody else is seeing. So there's a lot of discussion that goes into the analysis work that we use when we're trying to put together a business case, because we want to make sure that it stands up to the test of time. So that's, from a consulting perspective, that's a lot of what we do. Now on the client side, we'll oftentimes have different folks like an executive sponsor, who typically will get more of the readout, the summary of where things are at or what we're seeing. But we also have a team of more sort of day-to-day people that are, in the same amount of detail that we are. And we share a lot of information along the way. Again, we don't go off and do something in a bubble and then come back and go, ta-da, here's all your information. We really try to co-collaborate and co-create so that everybody's making progress and getting the information, digesting it, and becoming familiar with it, because ultimately, that's the organization that has to articulate all of this to an executive.
I think that's great, because let me build on that a little bit, because when I work with Catherine and Juliana Stancampiano, who's also the CEO of the business, and she's like our chief learning architect, the three of us sort of complement one another. This gives you a sense of the roles that I see on these transformative engagements, and you can carry this down even some of the smaller projects. But Catherine and Juliana are great facilitators, and they're the ones that typically engage directly with stakeholders. We call it asking like Zen-like questions. You want to ask open-ended questions and get your stakeholders talking. And they're very good about that. So you have somebody playing that role of facilitator to getting your target audience talking about their requirements, their needs, because they're going to put it in their language. And I'm sitting in the background and I'm basically recording this information, capturing it. And I'm also looking at collecting the business data. So there's somebody typically helping to capture the information, look at the business data side and the metric side, and there's someone helping to play the role of facilitator. I'd say another key role that we have, and Catherine wears dual hats here, is we always have a creative service element to what we do. I know that we talked earlier about the important need for storytelling. When you're doing like large transformative type of work, there's a lot of rigor that goes into, and Catherine does a great job helping to visualize the business case to tell a story and getting it rendered in a view that has a creative elements weaved into it, that the data is presented in a way that's easy to be understood. It's logically, it flows well. So we always have a creative service element to it, because I think visualizing the business case is really important, and that often differentiates from what we've seen on what gets funded and what doesn't get funded based upon the amount of rendering and visualization you're able to do and the storytelling around it. What do you think, Catherine?
Yeah, I would love to show an example just
Yeah.
along the lines of what we were just talking about. We put a lot of creative and visual design energy into the things that we produce. And, you know, as a case in point, this is an example of one page of a business case where we wanted to just simply show what information we collected. So all of that sort of talk about method and all of the different ways that we have done the analysis. This will really hit home with executives when they can really see the rigor that's gone into something, and it's visualized in a way to have that impact. That's just one example, and we have a few others. Just to show, I can show one of the heat maps, Rob, is what I was
Yeah, that'd
thinking.
be cool. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So this one here, you know, this is an example of a heat map where we had a merger and acquisition, and what we wanted to do is go in and survey a whole bunch of these different areas. There was, you know, the L&D area, there were business owners, and then there were, you know, trainers, and this actually just goes to show a current state or baseline, as Rob likes to say, of where people's level of satisfaction was with the services that they were getting. And you can see that it wasn't particularly strong. Anything else you want to say about that, Rob?
Well, I think what I liked about this is we actually, when we did the survey, this is taking qualitative data and making it quantitative. And this actually was really important to help get the funding for modernizing the function that just was desperately needed. You can show the contrast between the perception of the value being delivered internally by the people creating the service versus the people that were sponsoring it and the recipients of the service. We don't have the other slide that shows the audience scores, but when you start to contrast those two things, like we did in some of these visuals, it really brings it to light when you visualize it in a certain way with a color coding in this particular case, so that people can hone in on, oh, okay, this is how we're performing. And they can go right in, like a couple of executives will go right in on the red areas, and they'll start pummeling, like hitting up with tons of questions. And that's why you need to have the rigor of the references behind you, help substantiate what, you know, some of the findings that you come up with. But this has been a great method for us to help articulate, you know, visually a problem area or a need.
Yeah. I think it also shows the comprehensive nature. I mean, you know, we were really doing something transformative with, you know, putting a new operating model in place. And so we really wanted to cover quite a few dimensions in this analysis. I think there's another example that also gets into some data visualization here that just provides, you know, some basic summary areas of attitudes and perceptions. And, you know, that really, the numbers really do help tell that kind of a story, whether it's numbers that you actually put in numerical form, or if you go, you know, and sort of visualize this way here, which is much more of a, wow, I can really see
the scorecard.
Yeah, the scorecard view, you know, the red, and it really does drive the conversation that has to take place. It really has to take place in order to get to clarity about what we're trying to achieve, what state we're trying to move from, and then help really shape what an initiative can look like to get there.
Yep. I think there's another heat map on here too, Catherine, on coverage that shows another way you can use a heat map.
Right. Yeah.
This
right
isn't
here.
like this isn't really sexy stuff, but this actually helped out tremendously, where we're able to articulate for an L&D organization that was providing services to different call centers, training 30,000 call center agents plus, who's consuming our services and at what concentration. And they're able to quickly see like, oh my goodness, we're only serving X% of our audience, and the strength of what's being consumed is not very high. So this shows you another way to visualize your data in a way to articulate, where we have strengths, where we have gaps, where we have weaknesses, so you can have a focused conversation with your stakeholders.
Yeah. Rob, I would love to address this question that came up in the chat, or in the Q&A from Gloria, which she asked, in your business case, do you find it helpful to include time estimates for the people involved along with the funding needed? And I feel like we have an example for that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, let's talk about that. That's the roadmap aspect of it, I think, is what where I would go with this, right? The roadmap, and then potentially the investment plan, which of course we had to blur out a lot of this, but I think we can talk through at least the structure of it.
Yeah, so there's two different time components that I can interpret that. So number one is, we always want to give a sense of what's the timing of when something's going to hit. Like if we're framing a project, what's the deliverable, or if it's a learning, when is it going to be physically delivered? What's that delivery schedule need to look like in terms of when the training is going to be consumed? The other component is, there's a level of effort that people like to see behind, how much time and effort is spent into a project. So there's two ways you can interpret that. We include all of that information in the business cases that we put together. And I think the trick is, depending upon your audience, it may differ the level of detail that you get into to show like a Gantt chart view, like a traditional project management chart view, or something like here, we got a roadmap view. We want to show a time horizon of something over 6 to 9 months. And it might be more executive level driven, where you have like, here's high level milestones, here's high level deliverables, here's a high level sense of when the training is going to get delivered. Absolutely, that's critical, because stakeholders want to know, when am I going to get my stuff, and when am I going to start to see the value of what's being delivered to me? Great question.
Yeah. And I think that investment plan, this text might be a little small to read, but we basically have a structure that connects the purpose, the business outcome, and then what the staffing could look like. And what we had in here was literally like, how many headcount, FTE, things like that, which, in a transformative type of a initiative, this is a lot of what you get into is, if you're going to calculate ROI and things of that nature, then a lot of times that does get into, do we have the team in place? Do we have the right operating structure? All of those different aspects. And so in this particular example, that's kind of how we looked at it. In another example, it might not necessarily be the staffing, of a project team, but it might be, development time and the investment, maybe even in technology or some of the other areas that that require the investment. So even before a given initiative gets off the ground, I think these are all great questions to ask about, what does that investment plan look like and how do we get to it?
Yeah, I think we have a project-sized one, just an example that we've used before, that's like a one-pager for a specific project.
yeah.
It doesn't have a timing in it, because there's a Gantt chart behind it and another slide. But you can see purpose objectives, what are the costs and staffing, what kind of outcomes. Traditionally what we've seen working with our clients that do budgeting, you go into a room with like your executive sponsor and their shared service peers, walk in together with their business cases, and they go through like dozens of these things over the course of hours. And they got to quickly have a common format to compare and contrast. Well, is this going to get funded, or is this going to get funded? So you need a good, strong one-pager for project-specific business cases. And this is like a format we've seen before. I mean, these come in all different kinds of shapes and colors, but having a good one-pager is really important with a strong, like, short talk track. Because when you get in to make your pitch, sometimes you have to compete for budget against your peers. That's happened in some projects that we've supported. And so you've got to have a compelling talk track to go with a compelling slide that can articulate the story for a specific project that needs to get funded in a given calendar cycle.
Yep. It's interesting too, because a lot of the examples that we've shown, this is a project level example. So if you kind of go back to our framework here of, a project versus a program versus an enterprise. And early on in the call, I think I saw a chat about like that sometimes we need to figure out how to show that training isn't just the answer. It's not the only answer,
Yeah.
that there's some strategic issues. And we've certainly been involved in, I mean, organizations today, especially large organizations, are just incredibly complex. And a lot of times it's really easy for some group to say, well, what if we just train our people on X or Y or Z? And to be able to take that step back and have the conversation that sometimes training isn't going to solve a specific problem. Sometimes it's more systemic than that. And, we've run across that with, when we're serving populations who are hourly workers, and a lot of the time they just simply don't have time to take training. So no matter how great the training may be, you have to overcome that other problem, which is about, being paid or not paid to actually learn. So those are some of the areas where if we look more like at a program and we collect all that data and we're really super focused on the outcome that we're trying to drive, we can start to pull together that narrative that tells the whole story of the picture and doesn't just go right to training.
Yep. So it sounds like we got a question, good question to wrap us up here.
Yeah. So as we approach kind of the end of our time for our session today, I'm wondering if both of you could share a little bit of advice for everyone on the line here about how to get started. I think there's a ton of work that goes into these business cases. So when you need to do one, you've got to start somewhere. Where should you start? What advice do you have for getting going?
I think that's a fabulous question. And I'm going to, because Catherine inspired me at the front end when she talked about sales enablement and you being a salesperson inside your company.
Mm-hmm.
A big thing that we try to talk to shared service leaders about is you've got to have business relationship management as a core foundation for your operating model, your organization. So make sure you're reaching out to your customers regularly to get the inputs, because you want to be able to understand and have a foot inside their business, talking in their terms, talking their language, having as good or better understanding of what their needs or problems are, so you can help translate those needs into something that could eventually be a project that has a business case around it. It's that upfront work of engagement and building those relationships with your internal customers, frankly, and understanding them and listening to them and facilitating with them to get those needs for what's impacting them most.
I think that's a great example. And I'll kind of tell a little story about a client we worked with who was he himself an executive, a VP level, and yet he had some thorny stakeholders and some relationships that he really needed to improve. And, he was thinking, how do I go into this meeting with this one person? What should I talk about? Do I have a deck? And he was thinking about all these different things that he would bring into this meeting. And we thought, well, what if you just go in and ask him, what's the outcome you're looking to drive in your business? Just super simple.
Yeah.
And he's like, wow, I never thought about that, but okay, I'll try it. And he did. And the meeting that they had was like one of the best conversations that, this stakeholder, he's like, wow, nobody ever asked me that. So I think that it's a lot simpler than we think to just start that conversation, as long as it's focused on their business and their outcomes that they're trying to drive. And then, we don't necessarily have to talk about everything under the sun about what the solution is yet. We can just have the conversation about what they're trying to drive, and it goes a long way to establishing that relationship.
I love what you just said, because it goes back to when I talked about those open-ended, we call them Zen-like questions, like what business outcomes are you trying to drive? Now, what I would say to come with that is come prepared with some insight. I mean, you might have some data or metrics or information about, some conversation, like there might be some preparatory conversations, but provide some insight, because you're a salesperson, but you're also an internal consultant. If you act like an internal consultant who's focused on solving a need or problem, bring that insight along with some of those nice open-ended questions, because you're going to really facilitate a fantastic dialogue that's around your internal customer and less around you and the technical aspects of learning. That's your job, is to translate all that goodness into all these great learning experiences that need to be implemented to help solve those needs and problems, but focus on your internal customer's need and wants using those methods.
Great.
That's awesome and great advice. So thank you both for that. I think we're going to start to wind it down here as we approach the top of the hour. And I know everyone's busy and headed off to all their other obligations today. So again, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone who has attended here. If you're sitting here wondering where you can get the recording of this webinar, if you want to know more about what we do or read more from Rob and Catherine and other folks on the team, there are plenty of ways to get connected with us. First of all, I did mention this at the top of the hour, but just another plug. We've got another webinar coming up in June 29th, end of the month, the importance of UI, UX in learning experience design. So you can subscribe to our newsletter, to our mailing list. That's right at oxygenexp.com. There's a big subscribe button in the top right corner, and that'll get you on the mailing list and keep you in the know. And of course, if you're here, you're probably on that list already. So keep your eyes on your inbox. As far as catching up with everything else that we've been doing, especially this year, there are a bunch of places that you can connect with what we're thinking and doing and talking about. So here they are in the chat window for everybody. There's the webinars page where you'll find a recording of today's webinar in just a couple of days once we get it edited and up, and everything else that we've done is available there in video format. There's a link to our blog. Again, lots of great insights there from our entire team. And if you're on LinkedIn or you're on Twitter, those links are there for you in the chat as well. So be sure to connect with us, and you can always drop us a line, connect@oxygenexp.com. Rob, Catherine, thank you so much